to introduce you to Brad Smith, Princeton's class of 1981. As Microsoft's president, Brad leads a team of more than 1,500 business, legal, and corporate affairs professionals located in more than 54 countries. He plays a key role in spearheading the company's work on critical issues involving the intersection of technology and society, including cybersecurity, privacy, artificial intelligence, environmental sustainability, human rights, immigration, and philanthropy. In his recent best-selling book, co-authored with Microsoft's Carol Ann Brown, Tools and Weapons, The Promise and the Pearl of the Digital Age, Smith urges the tech sector to assume more responsibility and calls for governments to act faster in addressing the challenges that technology is creating. The New York Times has called Smith the de facto ambassador for the technology industry at large. And the Australian Financial Review has described the technology industry's most respected figures. After attending Princeton University, he earned his JD from Columbia University Law School and studied international law and economics at the Graduate Institute in Geneva, Switzerland. Please join me in a warm welcome to Brad Smith.
Well, thanks, Rod. It's a real pleasure to be with you. I am passionate about all of these topics, Princeton, Microsoft, what we're doing together, and this issue of innovation. As you know, we thought we would take a slightly different approach to this session. We have three great Princeton professors, but rather than just talk with each other, we've been working together the last 6 weeks or so as I've been doing a little bit of travel in a very safe way. We decided to use the video format to try to bring the issue of innovation to life. And so looking forward to sharing with everybody what we were able to capture, some of the issues we wanted to describe, and then you and I can talk a little bit more. Hi, I'm Brad Smith from the class of 1981. I still remember when I had the conversation last year, a conversation about having this event, this celebration today. It was going to be a conversation in person on the Princeton campus with alumni and students and faculty. For me, there are few moments more magical than being back on the campus and seeing so many people being together in person. Well, as we all know, 2020 didn't exactly turn out as we planned, and so we're not together today. But one of the things that I think is so interesting is out of every challenge, there's always some new opportunity. So what we thought we would do is put this video format to work. As it turns out, I'm in Athens today to be with the Prime Minister and launch for Microsoft, in many ways, what we think about as the future of technology. New data centers that will be here in Greece. As I share some thoughts today with you about innovation, I think that this site is actually the perfect place to begin. Why? Why would we look to the future with the height of ancient Greece behind me? Well, come with me and I'll share with you why. What I want to do is take the topic of innovation and approach it from a series of different perspectives, slices of different thoughts, if you will. And this, to me, is the perfect place to begin. It's one of my favorite locations in Athens. It's what the Greeks called the Panika. This almost literally is where freedom of assembly was born. It's where 10 times a year the Greek citizens would meet, they'd listen to debates, they'd vote, they would decide their future. What does that have to do with the future of innovation? Well, I think it almost has everything to do with it, because as Pericles said, rather than viewing debate as an impediment to action, we value the wisdom that it creates in order to prepare us to take action. And as we think about where the future of science and technology, engineering and math will take us into the future, I think it grounds us in the importance of remembering that one of the most important questions is always, what values do we want innovation to serve? Now, this isn't just an abstract theoretical question in the world today. Increasingly, we're seeing the world's philosophers, religious leaders meet together to discuss issues like the ethics for artificial intelligence. And I think it speaks so clearly to the importance of what happens on a campus like Princeton. It shows us why freedom of expression and respect for other people's views is of such fundamental importance. And it shows us that the future of science will never be decided solely by, say, the students who major in science or engineering. More than ever, it often requires and benefits from a grounding in philosophy and religion, in history and economics and sociology, all of the liberal arts. And these issues are not abstract. Think about what it means for people to assemble. It's not just in a legislature. It means the ability to protest peacefully, a fundamental democratic right, a right that in so many ways was born here. But it's a right that technology itself can put at risk. If, say, for example, a government can use something like facial recognition to surveil and identify everyone who is out protesting. That's why I think it's so interesting that these also connect with questions of public policy. Just this year, Washington State became the first place where a legislature, like in effect what met here, enacted a law that said the police could not use facial recognition to surveil and identify peaceful protesters. I think that shows us something about where innovation and the humanities and social science all need to take us together. That's one way to think about innovation. There's a number of other slices to the issue as well. And for that, join me as we go back across the Atlantic. If you're like me, you may have been here before. I'm on 6th Avenue in Midtown Manhattan in the heart of New York City. But if you're like me, I bet you had no idea that on this very block, history was made. The date was April the 3rd, 1973. It was made by a man named Martin Cooper. He was working for Motorola at the time. How did he make history? Well, it turned out he had a prototype of this, the world's first cell phone. In fact, it was on this block that he made the world's first call with a cell phone. Who did he call? Well, it turned out he called his rival across the Hudson River, who was working at Bell Labs for AT&T. And why did he call from this intersection? Well, it's because when he hung up, he walked across the street to go into the Hilton Hotel. That's where Motorola held its press conference to announce this new invention. But as we look back from a vantage point of almost 50 years later, I think there's a few lessons that speak to our own future. The first is this. Did you know it took a full 11 years until March of 1984 to go from that phone call to the availability of this, the first cell phone that was sold to consumers? It took Motorola 11 years to continue to perfect the technology. Now, that seems like a long time, but in many ways it makes a lot of sense. There was a huge amount of innovation that was still needed. And even when this phone was first sold, you had to plug it in for 10 hours, and even then you only had enough battery life to use it for 35 minutes. It's almost the opposite of what we're used to today. There's a second lesson that I think is also really interesting. It's not just about creating a product. It's about building an ecosystem. It's about helping companies build the components that go into a device. It's about helping companies create apps to run on the platform. It's about equipping customers with the skills and the know-how to put technology to work. That is as important, perhaps even more important today than it was 50 years ago. And there's a final lesson that I think is interesting as well. Motorola couldn't sell this until it persuaded the regulators at the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, to get on board, to allocate the spectrum that would be needed. That too is important for all of us today. It's fascinating to look back at the progress of technology over 50 years. It's fascinating to think about how much
things have advanced. Today, we use these devices to do almost everything under the sun. For most people, we send a text message before we make a phone call. But thankfully, you can still pick this up and use it as a phone. After all, every once in a while, I might hold something like this. It might ring. It's the 1980s calling. They want their phone back. You know what? I think for all of us, we like looking at this, but we're happy to give it back. We have something so much better today.
Come with me. As you can see, we're not in Midtown Manhattan anymore. In fact, we're more than 2,500 miles west of the Hudson River. Behind me, you see this extraordinary view of the Columbia River, the largest waterway in the western United States. This canyon was carved more than 12,000 years ago by a series of 40 floods that occurred as the last ice age came to an end. It was 8,000 years ago that the first indigenous people lived here. They became what's known as the Yakima Nation. They were among the people who encountered Lewis and Clark in 1805 near here as their Corps of Discovery went down the Columbia River heading towards the Pacific Ocean. All of that water and all of this wind has played an important role, not only in creating what you see behind me, but for our future as well. Because it turns out it has created one of the world's largest supplies of clean and renewable energy, wind power, water power, power that today is fueling innovation. Innovation that's taking place in a number of ways, including in some of the world's largest data centers. They're near here. Come with me. I'll show you the role they play. The view may be generic, but this is actually one of my favorite places in the world. Why? Well, I think it represents the most important infrastructure of the 21st century. This is a part of Microsoft's Columbia data center campuses. These house the computers that fuel our lives. There are more than 20 buildings, each large enough to house 2 commercial aircraft. They fill 2 million square feet. They're spread out over 300 acres. But what's really interesting is what's inside. It's something that almost no one ever gets to go see. But come with me. It's COVID times. I need to wear my mask, but I'll show you around. Well, as we walk around, first, I've just spared you not just a metal detector, but what is probably the longest and most substantial security checkpoint you'll ever find on planet Earth. But what is so interesting to me is what you see here. This is just a glimpse of the types of server computers that we find in room after room and building after building on these campuses. There are almost 500,000 of these server computers. They store as much data as you would find in more than 50,000 libraries of Congress. And I think that captures so well how this really is the infrastructure for almost everything that we're engaged in today. The way you live your life, the way you do your work, the way research and development are all moving forward. It all relies on this enormous amount of data and this enormous amount of computing power. So you just see here so much innovation all connecting together. But actually, that's not the end of the story. Come back outside and I'll show you one more really interesting piece. These campuses represent not only the most advanced digital infrastructure in the world, but some of the most advanced energy infrastructure as well. Why? Well, first, if we ever lose power from the electrical grid, we need to keep the computers running. There are more than 19,000 battery cells, each like the battery under the hood of your car, that will do just that. And at the same time that that happens, these big electrical generators will start operating as well. In fact,
There's more than 140 of these generators on these campuses. Each of these will power the equivalent of 3,000 homes. The good news is with the latest advances in emissions technology, they actually give out less emission than a typical lawnmower you might use in your backyard. Each today runs on diesel fuel. In fact, there are tens of thousands of gallons of diesel fuel stored here, but not 10 years from now. We've said that by the end of this decade, each one of these needs to go. They'll be replaced by either new generators that run on hydrogen power or new advanced fuel cells. And in that, you see this extraordinary intersection between digital technology, energy technology, environmental science, and the need for innovation. Now, let me share one last slice of innovation from a different destination. Come with me. Well, we've now moved about 200 miles to the west, which means in this short period of time, we've gone from the shores of the Aegean to the Atlantic coast to the Columbia River, and now we're near the Pacific waters of Puget Sound. We're in Redmond, Washington, near Seattle. We're on Microsoft's campus, a place where 60,000 people come to work at least each weekday when we're not in COVID times. Like the Princeton campus itself, there's a lot of expansion going on. In fact, we have a $4 billion construction project to build 17 new buildings. But I think more interesting than that is the kindred spirit that I think is shared between a lot of what happens here and what happens at Princeton. I'm right outside Building 99. It houses one of the labs for Microsoft Research. It's the basic research arm of Microsoft. Let me take you inside and I'll show you some more. We're now inside Building 99 in the hardware lab. This is where we build prototypes for the researchers who work here. They're among the 1,200 researchers who have PhDs and work in 8 locations around the world. In many ways, this represents one branch of basic research in the world today. And in many ways, when you look at what happens at Princeton and other universities, that's another branch of what, in fact, is a common tree. It's a tree that has its roots in Menlo Park, New Jersey. That's where Thomas Edison, in 1876, created what was really the world's first organized research laboratory. In that case, obviously, for industry. In the 150 years that have followed, one branch has gone into the private sector, to places like Bell Labs at AT&T, and then IBM, and these days, places like Google and Microsoft. But the truth of the matter is that branch is actually far smaller than the other. The other is at the nation's research universities, including Princeton. The United States discovered on the path to winning World War II that research at universities, basic research in science and technology, was really indispensable, not just for winning the war, but for nurturing innovation and ultimately providing the key ingredient for American competitiveness. That's now something that's appreciated, in fact, around the world. A lot of times today, that research depends on continued financial support from donors like alumni and from parts of the federal government, like the National Science Foundation and the Department of Energy. And in some ways, every day, we see critical research advancing in new forms of collaboration across the campus, among different universities, and even between the world of higher education and the private sector. Here at Microsoft Research, we've long pursued important research partnerships with many universities, including Princeton, with the Computer Science Department at Princeton, and these days, with the Department of Molecular Biology, and even with the School of Public and International Affairs to take new steps to protect democracy. That, in so many ways, is really where research is headed. Investment, collaboration, creativity. And of course, our researchers, I guess, are like everybody else. Now and then, they need to be reminded to clean up after themselves. Come with me. I'll show you one last part of this building, and we'll bring this to a close.
We're now in the lobby of Building 99 next to this sculpture called Ada. It's named after Ada Lovelace, one of the premier mathematicians of her time, who in the 1800s was an early pioneer in what became computer science. This sculpture was created by an architect who spent time here. It has more than 800 bespoke parts, all connected together. And they're not just connected with each other. They're connected with cameras and sensors throughout this building. Using an AI algorithm and machine learning, they sense the mood of the people who are working here. If everybody's having a bad day, it's red. But on a good day, when people are creative and getting things done, it's more this blush color that you see today. This, to me, is a great backdrop to bring everything together. The future is about innovation in basic research. And I think it gives us the opportunity to reflect on this. 2020 has been a hard year. Let's face it, it's been a different year than what any of us imagined. But I still fundamentally believe that this can be an exciting decade ahead. At a place like Princeton, it's an opportunity to invest not just in new buildings, but what happens inside them. The innovations for new research that will connect with the next generation of students. And for all of them, and for all of us, we'll have the chance to come out of this COVID pandemic and not just rebuild, but reimagine a brighter future. A future that creates more opportunity, that advances racial equity, that addresses the issues of our time, and builds an ongoing platform for progress. The future is bright. Now we have to create it. Thanks for joining me. Thanks for tuning in.
Well, back to you.
Thank you, Brad, for that very inspiring as well as entertaining video that took us halfway around the world to learn about innovation and the innovation that's taking place at Microsoft. I'm sure that everyone in the audience, similar to me, was thrilled to see that video. And I'm delighted that we have a few minutes now here for some discussion. Certainly, if members of the audience have a question or two, if time permits, I will read some of those. So do put those in the poll section. Brad, I was moved by your comment that the future of science will never be solely decided by those who actually major in science and engineering. In fact, for me as the Vice Dean for Innovation here, one of the things I always try and stress about what's unique at Princeton is the fact that we so nicely merge science and engineering with the liberal arts and humanities. And so I'm just curious to you, I'd like for you to elaborate a little bit more. Why is it so important to bridge the humanities and the social sciences with science and engineering?
Well, I just think if you look at the world today, digital technology and data are just impacting every part of everyone's life and are impacting every part of society. And so if we're going to ensure that technology and innovation serve societies well, we actually have to start by recognizing that in the world today, everybody who majors in liberal arts needs to learn some computer science or about data and engineering, and everybody who majors in something like computer science or engineering really needs to learn some more from the liberal arts. I am sort of the liberal arts representative, if you will, and the senior leadership team at Microsoft. And with each passing year, I actually find that there are more people and more jobs for individuals who come from my background, because we all need to work together to make sure technology stays on the right course.
Thank you for that comment. Again, at these academic institutions, again, in a place like Princeton, I always like to talk about convergence. And again, this is convergence of different disciplines. And I think the structure at academic institutions are right for that, because we have all of these varied disciplines on campus. Again, but in industry, where perhaps there's a particular focus, how do you go about trying to drive this convergence of these different disciplines where perhaps new ideas and new innovations in fact lie?
Well, I think one of the really interesting aspects of innovation today is it's so much more multidisciplinary. That's one of the things we tried to capture in the video, just even looking at a data center and recognizing it's not just about digital technology, it's about energy technology, and it's about environmental science. And in the same way that you bring people together from, say, different faculties at a place like Princeton, which I think benefits from the relatively small size, at a big company, you have to do the same thing. More and more, it's about creating teams of people that come from different parts of the company and actually different academic or intellectual disciplines so they can solve problems together.
Great, thank you, thank you. Now, Microsoft is a very large multinational corporation. You talked about the importance of collaborations with academic institutions, including here at Princeton, computer science and molecular biology. So I was wondering if you can share with us a little bit, how do you envision the future in terms of these collaborations between academia and industry? And then from the viewpoint of Microsoft, how do you go about deciding which of these institutions you actually interact with, given the scope of the endeavors at Microsoft, and as you said, the scale of academic research in the US?
Well, I think both aspects of that question are so interesting. I mean, it would be really easy to fall into a trap at a place like Microsoft. We could say we have 1,200 PhDs doing basic research. That's a huge scale. We don't need to pursue collaborative efforts, with people at other institutions. But that's never been part of the DNA of the place. It's always been grounded in not just pursuing basic research, but publishing papers. And so often today, the real breakthroughs come in collaborations between people, say, here and at universities, including Princeton, increasingly people at other companies as well. And you're going to see just in the next few minutes, when you hear from some of the Princeton faculty, the interesting range of intellectual academic disciplines that are connecting with what we're doing today. Of course, the other part of your question alludes to how hard it can be to bring people together when you work at a really big institution. We have 160,000 employees at a place like Microsoft. And so one of the first conclusions that I sort of jumped on when I was named the company's president 5 years ago was I could pursue my job by issuing executive orders, and people would probably read them and ignore them. If I was really going to get something done, I had to create new ways to bring us together. So, for example, one of the steps we took was to create a university relations team to really manage our partnerships with 16 major research universities in North America, including Princeton. And so what it does is it connects the people at Microsoft that are recruiting students, that are pursuing these research collaborations, that are providing technology tools and services to the university. Before we did that, it was probably easier to find somebody at Princeton who knew what all the various parts of Microsoft were doing with the university than, say, at the company itself. And I just think that has been an ongoing lesson. It's always finding the right people and just getting people to spend more time with each other.
Yes, that is definitely a challenge for sure. Now, the title of this session is, building collaborations and inclusive innovation. And at the end of your presentation, you alluded to, the future of building a better future, one with more racial equity, participation, et cetera. And so I was wondering if you comment in terms of how important it is for Microsoft when they think about innovation to be thinking about inclusive innovation.
Well, it's actually just an imperative because I think one of the things I've learned is if you don't think about the need for serving an inclusive and diverse population and you go forward and develop technology, you actually make people's lives worse rather than better. Like if we develop a new version of a product and it is not finely attuned to, say, the needs of someone who is blind or someone who is deaf, we can end up inadvertently undermining their ability even to just pursue a living. But when we think about it the opposite way, when we start by just trying to understand a human problem and basic human needs, and then we think about different groups of people and ask ourselves, okay, how can technology help contribute to a solution
to this very human problem, I think that's when we start to take great strides forward. And that again sort of takes us back to what I think is such a strength at Princeton: the smaller campus, the multidisciplinary approach, and the close interaction between faculty and students, and with so many others outside the university's four walls in the world today.
Excellent. Thank you for that. We have many questions coming in from the audience. Unfortunately, we do not have time to go through them all today, but I will finish with one final question here, Brad. We do have a lot of students that are listening in today. And so my final question to you is, what advice would you provide to current Princeton students who are thinking about starting their careers in innovation and technology?
Well, I would say go forward with a sense of hope and optimism and some courage, because I think all of those things will serve you well. I think, across this country, but really around the world, what we've learned is, your early years in a career are both a time to learn everything you can, from people that will spend their time sharing what they've learned with you. But it is a time in your life when you can experiment, you can afford to take some risks. So many of the great engineering and technology and scientific leaders of our time started out with an initial failure or two. And so go forward with that long-term perspective. There has never been a world that I think needs young entrepreneurs and innovators more than we need you today. And this may be the year we'll all want to forget, but I think this is going to be a decade to remember when we just consider how much we can contribute to solving the great issues of our time.
And with that, this has been a wonderful session. Thank you very much, Brad, for your insights and your support of Princeton and Princeton Innovation. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. Thanks to everybody.
I would now like to pass the mic over to my colleague, Chip Hay, in corporate engagement at Princeton University.
Well, thanks, Rod and Brad, for that terrific session. As we've seen, innovation and research interact with universities like Princeton in a whole variety of areas. To explore this in greater detail, we now have a panel of 3 Princeton faculty members who have worked with and collaborated with Microsoft researchers in various ways. To moderate our panel, we have Elizabeth Bruce from the University Relations team at Microsoft. And so I'm now glad to introduce Elizabeth and the panel.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chip. Thank you, Rodney. And I'd also like to thank the Office of the Dean for Research at Princeton for hosting this event and this session. I'm Elizabeth Bruce. My role at Microsoft is University Relations and Partnerships. I've worked with Princeton over the past 4 years, and I've worked with each of our panelists today. Our focus is on innovation and collaboration, of course, specifically around collaboration across industry and academia. The panelists will talk about projects that are highlighting different kinds of research, from computer science to molecular biology and politics and international affairs.